The Man in the Brown Suit by Agatha Christie. Chapter 13. It has been a curious evening. The only costume that fitted me in the barber's emporium was that of a teddy bear. I don't mind playing bears with some nice young girls on a winter's evening in England, but it's hardly an ideal costume for the equator. However, I created a good deal of merriment and won first prize for brought on board, an absurd term for a costume hired for the evening. Still, as nobody seemed to have the least idea whether they were made or brought, it didn't matter. Mrs. Blair refused to dress up. Apparently, she is at one with Paget on the matter. Colonel Reyes followed her example, and Bedingfeld had concocted a gypsy costume for herself and looked extraordinarily well. Paget said he had a headache and didn't appear. To replace him, I asked a quaint little fellow called Reeves. He's a prominent member of the South African Labour Party. Horrible little man, but I want to keep in with him, as he gives me information that I need. I want to understand this rand business from both sides. Dancing was a hot affair. I danced twice with Bedingfeld and she had to pretend she liked it. I danced once with Mrs. Blair, who didn't trouble to pretend, and I victimized various other damsels whose appearance struck me favorably. Then we went down to supper. I had ordered champagne. The steward suggested Cliquot 1911 as being the best they had on the boat, and I fell in with his suggestion. I seemed to have hit on the one thing that would loosen Colonel Reyes's tongue. Far from being taciturn, the man became actually talkative. For a while this amused me, then it occurred to me that Colonel Reyes, and not myself, was becoming the life and soul of the party. He chaffed me at length about keeping a diary. It will reveal all your indiscretions one of these days, peddler. My dear Reyes, I said, I venture to suggest that I am not quite the fool you think me. I may commit indiscretions, but I don't write them down in black and white. After my death, my executors will know my opinion of a great many people, but I doubt if they will find anything to add or detract from their opinion of me. A diary is useful for recording the idiosyncrasies of other people, but not one's own. There is such a thing as unconscious self-revelation, though. In the eyes of the psychoanalyst, all things are vile, I replied sententiously. You must have had a very interesting life, Colonel Reyes, said Miss Bedingfeld, gazing at him with wide, starry eyes. That's how they do it, these girls. Othello charmed Desdemona by telling her stories, but, oh, didn't Desdemona charm Othello by the way she listened? Anyway, the girl set Reyes off all right. He began to tell lion stories. A man who has shot lions in large quantities has an unfair advantage over other men. It seemed to me that it was time I, too, told a lion story. One of a more sprightly character. By the way, I remarked, that reminds me of a rather exciting tale I heard. A friend of mine was out on a shooting trip somewhere in East Africa. One night he came out of his tent for some reason and was startled by a low growl. He turned sharply and saw a lion crouching to spring. He had left his rifle in the tent. Quick as thought, he ducked, and the lion sprang right over his head. Annoyed at having missed him, the animal growled and prepared to spring again. Again he ducked, and again the lion sprang right over him. This happened a third time, but by now he was close to the entrance of the tent, and he darted in and seized his rifle. When he emerged, rifle in hand, the lion had disappeared. That puzzled him greatly. He crept round the back of the tent, where there was a little clearing. There, sure enough, was the lion, busily practicing low jumps. This was received with a roar of applause. I drank some champagne. On another occasion, I remarked, This friend of mine had a second curious experience. He was trekking across country, and being anxious to arrive at his destination before the heat of the day, he ordered his boys to inspan whilst it was still dark. They had some trouble in doing so, as the mules were very restive, but at last they managed it, and a start was made. The mules raced along like the wind, and when daylight came, they saw why. In the darkness, the boys had inspanned a lion as the near wheeler. This, too, was well received, a ripple of merriment going round the table, but I am not sure that the greatest tribute did not come from my friend, the labor member, who remained pale and serious. My God, he said anxiously. Who unharnessed them? I must go to Rhodesia, said Mrs. Blair. After what you have told us, Colonel Reyes, I simply must. It's a horrible journey though, 5 days in the train. You must join me on my private car, I said gallantly. Oh, Sir Eustace, how sweet of you. Do you really mean it? Do I mean it? I exclaimed reproachfully and drank another glass of champagne. Just about another week, and we shall be in South Africa, sighed Mrs. Blair. Ah, South Africa, I said sentimentally, and began to quote from a recent speech of mine at the Colonial Institute. What has South Africa to show the world? What indeed? Her fruit and her farms, her wool and her wattles, her herds and her hides, her gold and her diamonds. I was hurrying on, because I knew that as soon as I paused, Reeves would butt in and inform me that the hides were worthless because the animals hung themselves up on barbed wire or something of that sort, would crab everything else, and end up with the hardships of the miners on the Rand. And I was not in the mood to be abused as a capitalist. However, the interruption came from another source at the magic word diamonds. Diamonds, said Mrs. Blair ecstatically. Diamonds, breathed Miss Bedingfeld. They both addressed Colonel Reyes. I suppose you've been to Kimberley. I had been to Kimberley too, but I didn't manage to say so in time. Reyes was being inundated with questions. What were mines like? Was it true that the natives were kept shut up in compounds? And so on. Reyes answered their questions and showed a good knowledge of his subject. He described the methods of housing the natives, the searches instituted, and the various precautions that De Beers took. Then it's practically impossible to steal any diamonds? Asked Mrs. Blair with as keen an air of disappointment as though she had been journeying there for the express purpose. Nothing's impossible, Mrs. Blair. Thefts do occur, like the case I told you of where the Kafir hid the stone in his wound. Yes, but on a large scale. Once, in recent years. Just before the war, in fact. You must remember the case, Peddler. You were in South Africa at the time? I nodded. Tell us, cried Miss Bedingfeld. Oh, do tell us. Ray smiled. Very well, you shall have the story. I suppose most of you have heard of Sir Lawrence Yeardsley, the great South African mining magnate. His mines were gold mines, but he comes into the story through his son. You may remember that just before the war, rumors were afield of a new potential Kimberley hidden somewhere in the rocky floor of the British Guiana jungles. Two young explorers, so it was reported, had returned from that part of South America bringing with them a remarkable collection of rough diamonds, some of them of considerable size. Diamonds of small size had been found before in the neighborhood of the Essequibo and Mazaruni rivers, but these two young men, John Yeardsley and his friend Lucas, claimed to have discovered beds of great carbon deposits at the common head of two streams. The diamonds were of every color: pink, blue, yellow, green, black, and the purest white. Yeardsley and Lucas came to Kimberley where they were to submit their gems to inspection. At the same time, a sensational robbery was found to have taken place at De Beers. When sending diamonds to England, they are made up into a packet. This remains in the big safe, of which the two keys are held by two different men, whilst a third man knows the combination. They are handed to the bank, and the bank send them to England. Each package is worth, roughly, about £100,000. On this occasion, the bank was struck by something a little unusual about the sealing of the packet. It was opened and found to contain knobs of sugar. Exactly how suspicion came to fasten on John Eardsley, I do not know. It was remembered that he had been very wild at Cambridge and that his father had paid his debts more than once. Anyhow, it soon got about that this story of South American diamond fields was all a fantasy. John Eardsley was arrested. In his possession was found a portion of the De Beer diamonds. But the case never came to court. Sir Lawrence Eardsley paid over a sum equal to the missing diamonds, and De Beers did not prosecute. Exactly how the robbery was committed has never been known. But the knowledge that his son was a thief broke the old man's heart. He had a stroke shortly afterwards. As for John, his fate was in a way merciful. He enlisted, went to the war, fought there bravely, and was killed, thus wiping out the stain on his name. Sir Lawrence himself had a third stroke and died about a month ago. He died intestate, and his vast fortune passed to his next of kin, a man whom he hardly knew. The colonel paused. A babble of ejaculations and questions broke out. Something seemed to attract Miss Bedingfield's attention, and she turned in her chair. At the little gasp she gave, I, too, turned. My new secretary, Rayburn, was standing in the doorway. Under his tan, his face had the pallor of one who has seen a ghost. Evidently, Race's story had moved him profoundly. Suddenly conscious of our scrutiny, he turned abruptly and disappeared. Do you know who that is? Asked Anne Bedingfield abruptly. That's my other secretary, I explained. Mr. Rayburn. He's been seedy up to now. She toyed with the bread by her plate. Has he been your secretary long? Not very long, I said cautiously. But caution is useless with a woman. The more you hold back, the more she presses forward. And Bedingfield made no bones about it. How long? She asked bluntly. Well, I engaged him just before I sailed. Old friend of mine recommended him. She said nothing more, but relapsed into a thoughtful silence. I turned to Race with the feeling that it was my turn to display an interest in his story. Who is Sir Lawrence next of kin, Race? Do you know? I should say so, he replied with a smile. I am. Chapter 14. Anne's narrative resumed. It was on the night of the fancy dress dance that I decided that the time had come for me to confide in someone. So far I had played a lone hand and rather enjoyed it. Now suddenly everything was changed. I distrusted my own judgment, and for the first time a feeling of loneliness and desolation crept over me. I sat on the edge of my bunk, still in my gypsy dress, and considered the situation. I thought first of Colonel Race. He had seemed to like me. He would be kind, I was sure. And he was no fool. Yet, as I thought it over, I wavered. He was a man of commanding personality. He would take the whole matter out of my hands. And it was my mystery. There were other reasons, too, which I would hardly acknowledge to myself, but which made it inadvisable to confide in Colonel Race. Then I thought of Mrs. Blair. She, too, had been kind to me. I did not delude myself into the belief that that really meant anything. It was probably a mere whim of the moment. All the same, I had it in my power to interest her. She was a woman who had experienced most of the ordinary sensations of life. I proposed to supply her with an extraordinary one. And I liked her ease of manner, her lack of sentimentality, her freedom from any form of affection. My mind was made up. I decided to seek her out then and there. She would hardly be in bed yet. Then I remembered that I did not know the number of her cabin. My friend, the night stewardess, would probably know. I rang the bell. After some delay, it was answered by a man. He gave me the information I wanted. Mrs. Blair's cabin was number 71. He apologized for the delay in answering the bell, but explained that he had all the cabins to attend to. Where is the stewardess, then? I asked. They all go off duty at 10 o'clock. No, I mean the night stewardess. No stewardess on at night, miss. But a stewardess came the other night, about 1 o'clock. You must have been dreaming, miss. There's no stewardess on duty after 10. He withdrew, and I was left to digest this morsel of information. Who was the woman who had come to my cabin on the night of the 22nd? My face grew graver as I realized the cunning and audacity of my unknown antagonists. Then, pulling myself together, I left my own cabin and sought that of Mrs. Blair. I knocked at the door. Who's that? Called her voice from within. It's me, Anne Bedingfeld. Oh, come in, gypsy girl. I entered. A good deal of scattered clothing lay about, and Mrs. Blair herself was draped in one of the loveliest kimonos I had ever seen. It was all orange and gold and black and made my mouth water to look at it. Mrs. Blair, I said abruptly, I want to tell you the story of my life, that is, if it isn't too late and you won't be bored. Not a bit. I always hate going to bed, said Mrs. Blair, her face crinkling into smiles in the delightful way it had. And I should love to hear the story of your life. You're a most unusual creature, gypsy girl. Nobody else would think of bursting in on me at 1 a.m. to tell me the story of their life. Especially after snubbing my natural curiosity for weeks as you have done. I'm not accustomed to being snubbed. It's been quite a pleasing novelty. Sit down on the sofa and unburden your soul. I told her the whole story. It took some time as I was conscientious over all the details. She gave a deep sigh when I had finished, but she did not say at all what I had expected her to say. Instead, she looked at me, laughed a little, and said, Do you know, Anne, you're a very unusual girl? Haven't you ever had qualms? Qualms? I asked, puzzled. Yes, qualms, qualms, qualms. Starting off alone with practically no money. What will you do when you find yourself in a strange country with all your money gone? It's no good bothering about that until it comes. I've got plenty of money still. The 25 pounds that Mrs. Flaming gave me is practically intact, and then I won the sweep yesterday. That's another 15 pounds. Why, I've got lots of money. 40 pounds. Lots of money. My God, murmured Mrs. Blair. I couldn't do it, Anne, and I've plenty of pluck in my own way. I couldn't start off gaily with a few pounds in my pocket and no idea as to what I was doing and where I was going. But that's the fun of it, I cried, thoroughly roused. It gives one such a splendid feeling of adventure. She looked at me, nodded once or twice, and then smiled. Lucky Anne. There aren't many people in the world who feel as you do. Well, I said impatiently, what do you think of it all, Mrs. Blair? I think it's the most thrilling thing I ever heard. Now, to begin with, you will stop calling me Mrs. Blair. Suzanne will be ever so much better. Is that agreed? I should love it, Suzanne. Good girl. Now let's get down to business. You say that in Sir Eustace's secretary, not that long-faced Paget, the other one, you recognize the man who was stabbed and came into your cabin for shelter. I nodded. That gives us two links connecting Sir Eustace with the tangle. The woman was murdered in his house, and it's his secretary who gets stabbed at the mystic hour of 1 o'clock. I don't suspect Sir Eustace himself, but it can't be all coincidence. There's a connection somewhere, even if he himself is unaware of it. Then there's the queer business of the stewardess, she continued thoughtfully. What was she like? I hardly noticed her. I was so excited and strung up, and a stewardess seemed such an anticlimax. But, yes, I did think her face was familiar. Of course it would be if I'd seen her about the ship. Her face seemed familiar to you, said Suzanne. Sure she wasn't a man? She was very tall, I admitted. Hum. Hardly Sir Eustace, I should think, nor Mr. Paget, wait. She caught up a scrap of paper and began drawing feverishly. She inspected the result with her head poised on one side. A very good likeness of the Rev. Edward Chichester. Now for the etceteras. She passed the paper over to me. Is that your stewardess? Why, yes, I cried. Suzanne, how clever of you. She disdained the compliment with a light gesture. I've always had suspicions of that Chichester creature. Do you remember how he dropped his coffee cup and turned a sickly green when we were discussing Crippen the other day? And he tried to get cabin 17. Yes, it all fits in so far. But what does it all mean? What was really meant to happen at 1 o'clock in cabin 17? It can't be the stabbing of the secretary. There would be no point in timing that for a special hour on a special day in a special place. No, it must have been some kind of appointment, and he was on his way to keep it when they knifed him. But who was the appointment with? Certainly not with you. It might have been with Chichester. Or it might have been with Paget. That seems unlikely, I objected. They can see each other any time. We both sat silent for a minute or two, then Suzanne started off on another tack. Could there have been anything hidden in the cabin? That seems more probable, I agreed. It would explain my things being ransacked the next morning. But there was nothing hidden there, I'm sure of it. The young man couldn't have slipped something into a drawer the night before. I shook my head. I should have seen him. Could it have been your precious piece of paper they were looking for? It might have been, but it seems rather senseless. It was only a time and a date, and they were both past by then. Suzanne nodded. That's so, of course. No, it wasn't the paper. By the way, have you got it with you? I'd rather like to see it. I had brought the paper with me as Exhibit A, and I handed it over to her. She scrutinized it, frowning. There's a dot after the 17. Why isn't there a dot after the 1 too? There's a space, I pointed out. Yes, there's a space, but... Suddenly she rose and peered at the paper, holding it as close under the light as possible. There was a repressed excitement in her manner. Anne, that isn't a dot. That's a flaw in the paper. A flaw in the paper, you see? So you've got to ignore it and just go by the spaces, the spaces. I had risen and was standing by her. I read out the figures as I now saw them. 171.22. You see, said Suzanne, it's the same, but not quite. It's 1 o'clock still, and the 22nd, but it's cabin 71. My cabin, Anne. We stood staring at each other, so pleased with our new discovery and so rapt with excitement that you might have thought we had solved the whole mystery. Then I fell to earth with a bump. But, Suzanne, nothing happened here at 1 o'clock on the 22nd. Her face fell also. No, it didn't. Another idea struck me. This isn't your own cabin, is it, Suzanne? I mean, not the one you originally booked. No, the purser changed me into it. I wonder if it was booked before sailing for someone who didn't turn up. I suppose we could find out. We don't need to find out, gypsy girl, cried Suzanne. I know. The purser was telling me about it. The cabin was booked in the name of Mrs. Gray, but it seems that Mrs. Gray was merely a pseudonym for the famous Madame Nadina. She's a celebrated Russian dancer, you know. She's never appeared in London, but Paris has been quite mad about her. She had a terrific success there all through the war. A thoroughly bad lot, I believe, but most attractive. The purser expressed his regrets that she wasn't on board in a most heartfelt fashion when he gave me her cabin, and then Colonel Reyes told me a lot about her. It seems there were very queer stories afloat in Paris. She was suspected of espionage, but they couldn't prove anything. I rather fancy Colonel Reyes was over there simply on that account. He's told me some very interesting things. There was a regular organized gang, not German in origin at all. In fact, the head of it, a man always referred to as the colonel, was thought to be an Englishman, but they never got any clue as to his identity. But there is no doubt that he controlled a considerable organization of international crooks. Robberies, espionages, assaults, he undertook them all and usually provided an innocent scapegoat to pay the penalty. Diabolically clever, he must have been. This woman was supposed to be one of his agents, but they couldn't get hold of anything to go upon. Yes, and we're on the right tack. Nadina is just the woman to be mixed up in this business. The appointment on the morning of the 22nd was with her in this cabin. But where is she? Why didn't she sail? A light flashed upon me. She meant to sail, I said slowly. Then why didn't she? Because she was dead. Suzanne, Nadina was the woman murdered at Marlow. My mind went back to the bare room in the empty house, and there swept over me again that indefinable sensation of menace and evil. With it came the memory of the falling pencil and the discovery of the roll of films. A roll of films that struck a more recent note. Where had I heard of a roll of films? And why did I connect that thought with Mrs. Blair? Suddenly I flew at her and almost shook her in my excitement. Your films, the ones that were passed to you through the ventilator? Wasn't that on the 22nd? The ones I lost. How do you know they were the same? Why would anyone return them to you that way, in the middle of the night? It's a mad idea. No, they were a message. The films had been taken out of the yellow tin case and something else put inside. Have you got it still? I may have used it. No, here it is. I remember I tossed it into the rack at the side of the bunk. She held it out to me. It was an ordinary round tin cylinder, such as films are packed in for the tropics. I took it with trembling hand, but even as I did so my heart leapt. It was noticeably heavier than it should have been. With shaking fingers, I peeled off the strip of adhesive plaster that kept it airtight. I pulled off the lid, and a stream of dull glassy pebbles rolled onto the bed. Pebbles, I said, keenly disappointed. Pebbles, cried Suzanne. The ring in her voice excited me. Pebbles? No, and not pebbles. Diamonds. Chapter 15. Diamonds. I stared, fascinated, at the glassy heap on the bunk. I picked up one which, but for the weight, might have been a fragment of broken bottle. Are you sure, Suzanne? Oh, yes, my dear. I've seen rough diamonds too often to have any doubts. They're beauties too, and some of them are unique, I should say. There's a history behind these. The history we heard tonight, I cried. You mean Colonel Race's story? It can't be a coincidence. He told it for a purpose. To see its effect, you mean? I nodded. Its effect on Sir Eustace? Yes. But, even as I said it, a doubt assailed me. Was it Sir Eustace who had been subjected to a test, or had the story been told for my benefit? I remembered the impression I had received on that former night of having been deliberately pumped. For some reason or other, Colonel Reyes was suspicious. But where did he come in? What possible connection could he have with the affair? Who is Colonel Reyes? I asked. That's rather a question, said Suzanne. He's pretty well known as a big game hunter, and, as you heard him say tonight, he was a distant cousin of Sir Lawrence Yeardsley. I've never actually met him until this trip. He journeys to and from Africa a good deal. There's a general idea that he does Secret Service work. I don't know whether it's true or not. He's certainly rather a mysterious creature. I suppose he came into a lot of money as Sir Lawrence Yeardsley's heir. My dear Anne, he must be rolling. You know, he'd be a splendid match for you. I can't have a good go at him with you aboard the ship, I said, laughing. Oh, these married women. We do have a pull, murmured Suzanne complacently. And everybody knows that I am absolutely devoted to Clarence, my husband, you know. It's so safe and pleasant to make love to a devoted wife. It must be very nice for Clarence to be married to someone like you. Well, I'm wearing to live with. Still, he can always escape to the Foreign Office where he fixes his eyeglass in his eye and goes to sleep in a big armchair. We might cable him to tell us all he knows about race. I love sending cables. And they annoy Clarence so. He always says a letter would have done as well. I don't suppose he'd tell us anything, though. He is so frightfully discreet. That's what makes him so hard to live with for long on end. But let us go on with our matchmaking. I'm sure Colonel Reyes is very attracted to you, Anne. Give him a couple of glances from those wicked eyes of yours, and the deed is done. Everyone gets engaged on board ship. There's nothing else to do. I don't want to get married. Don't you? Said Suzanne. Why not? I love being married, even to Clarence. I disdained her flippancy. What I want to know is, I said with determination, what has Colonel Reyes got to do with this? He's in it somewhere. You don't think it was mere chance, his telling that story? No, I don't, I said decidedly. He was watching us all narrowly. You remember, some of the diamonds were recovered, not all. Perhaps these are the missing ones, or perhaps. Perhaps what? I did not answer directly. I should like to know, I said, what became of the other young man. Not Yeardsley, but what was his name? Lucas. We are getting some light on the thing, anyway. It's the diamonds all these people are after. It must have been to obtain possession of the diamonds that the man in the brown suit killed Nadina. He didn't kill her, I said sharply. Of course he killed her. Who else could have done so? I don't know, but I'm sure he didn't kill her. He went into that house 3 minutes after her and came out as white as a sheet. Because he found her dead. But nobody else went in. Then the murderer was in the house already, or else he got in some other way. There's no need for him to pass the lodge, he could have climbed over the wall. Suzanne glanced at me sharply. The man in the brown suit, she mused. Who was he, I wonder? Anyway, he was identical with the doctor in the tube. He would have had time to remove his makeup and follow the woman to Marlow. She and Carton were to have met there, they both had an order to view the same house, and if they took such elaborate precautions to make their meeting appear accidental, they must have suspected they were being followed. All the same, Carton did not know that his shadow was the man in the brown suit. When he recognized him, the shock was so great that he lost his head completely and stepped back onto the line. That all seems pretty clear, don't you think so, Anne? I did not reply. Yes, that's how it was. He took the paper from the dead man, and in his hurry to get away, he dropped it. Then he followed the woman to Marlow. What did he do when he left there, when he had killed her, or, according to you, found her dead? Where did he go? Still I said nothing. I wonder, now, said Suzanne musingly. Is it possible that he induced Sir Eustace Pedler to bring him on board as his secretary? It would be a unique chance of getting safely out of England and dodging the hue and cry. But how did he square Sir Eustace? It looks as though he had some hold over him. Or over Paget, I suggested in spite of myself. You don't seem to like Paget, Anne. Sir Eustace says he's a most capable and hard-working young man. And, really, he may be for all we know against him. Well, to continue my surmises. Rayburn is the man in the brown suit. He had read the paper he dropped. Therefore, misled by the dot as you were, he attempts to reach cabin 17 at 1 o'clock on the 22nd, having previously tried to get possession of the cabin through Paget. On the way there, somebody knifes him. Who? I interpolated. Chichester. Yes, it all fits in. Cable to Lord Nasby that you have found the man in the brown suit and your fortune's made, Anne. There are several things you've overlooked. What things? Rayburn's got a scar, I know, but a scar can be faked easily enough. He's the right height and build. What's the description of a head with which you pulverized them at Scotland Yard? I trembled. Suzanne was a well-educated, well-read woman, but I prayed that she might not be conversant with technical terms of anthropology. Dolichocephalic, I said lightly. Suzanne looked doubtful. Was that it? Yes. Long-headed, you know. A head whose width is less than 75% of its length, I explained fluently. There was a pause. I was just beginning to breathe freely when Suzanne said suddenly, What's the opposite? What do you mean, the opposite? Well, there must be an opposite. What do you call the heads whose breadth is more than 75% of their length? Brachycephalic, I murmured unwillingly. That's it. I thought that was what you said. Did I? It was a slip of the tongue. I meant dolichocephalic, I said with all the assurance I could muster. Suzanne looked at me searchingly. Then she laughed. You lie very well, gypsy girl. But it will save time and trouble now if you tell me all about it. There's nothing to tell, I said unwillingly. Isn't there? Said Suzanne gently. I suppose I shall have to tell you, I said slowly. I'm not ashamed of it. You can't be ashamed of something that just happens to you. That's what he did. He was detestable, rude, and ungrateful, but that I think I understand. It's like a dog that's been chained up or badly treated, it'll bite anybody. That's what he was like, bitter and snarling. I don't know why I care, but I do. I care horribly. Just seeing him has turned my whole life upside down. I love him. I want him. I'll walk all over Africa barefoot till I find him, and I'll make him care for me. I'd die for him. I'd work for him, slave for him, steal for him, even beg or borrow for him. There, now you know. Suzanne looked at me for a long time. You're very un-English, gypsy girl, she said at last. There's not a scrap of the sentimental about you. I've never met anyone who was at once so practical and so passionate. I shall never care for anyone like that, mercifully for me, and yet I envy you, gypsy girl. It's something to be able to care. Most people can't. But what a mercy for your little doctor man that you didn't marry him. He doesn't sound at all the sort of individual who would enjoy keeping high explosive in the house. So there's to be no cabling to Lord Nasby. I shook my head. And yet you believe him to be innocent? I also believe that innocent people can be hanged. HM. Yes. But, and dear, you can face facts, face them now. In spite of all you say, he may have murdered this woman. No, I said. He didn't. That's sentiment. No, it isn't. He might have killed her. He may even have followed her there with that idea in his mind. But he wouldn't take a bit of black cord and strangle her with it. If he'd done it, he would have strangled her with his bare hands. Suzanne gave a little shiver. Her eyes narrowed appreciatively. HM. Anne, I am beginning to see why you find this young man of yours so attractive.